Well, great. My name is Ross Yelsey. I work here in the Office of Admission at Columbia Journalism School. And this is one of my favorite program webinars of the year because I'm actually an alum of this program, the Master of Arts program here at the J School. And I'm really excited to have representatives from each of the four concentrations from this program here to talk with you about the different opportunities for study within the MA and to give you a better sense on what the MA program is, especially as maybe some of you have just started looking at our opportunities here and are still confused a little bit about which one might be the right fit for you. And the good news is that if you are watching this live, or if you're watching a video of this relatively recent, short time after this, there's going to be about 2 months to put together an application for the MA program. The MA application will be due January 5th, which means that, based on this conversation, if you feel like this is a good program for what you're looking for, and if you feel like you have the background to succeed in it, you'll have plenty of time to chat with our team and prepare an application. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation now. You don't have to feel too rushed, I hope, to put together an app if you are thinking about the MA program. But I think to start, as I mentioned, sometimes there might be some confusion. You might be looking at some other school sites and they only have one type of program, an MS program or an MA program or an MJ program, and you're trying to make sense on what these different programs are. And at our school, as you've probably seen, we have an MA program and an MS program. And I thought to start, we would just try to kind of explain a bit about what the MA program is. What is it kind of structured to do, and who is it suited for? And I thought I'd ask first Professor Winnie O'Kelly, who's here, former Dean of Academic Affairs and professor in the business program.
Hey, nice to see everybody. Thank you, Ross. I think it's easiest to maybe think about the MA program. It is a small but mighty program intended for people who have some experience. Increasingly, the MS program has a lot of people who are just starting their careers, people who are learning those 5 Ws: who, what, where, when, and how to cover a news story. The MA program is for people with some experience, and that might vary a great deal. So we can talk more about that perhaps as we go forward. But if you've got some experience and you're thinking you want to take your career to the next level, the MA program may very well be the best choice for you. There are concentrations available for people who are interested in particular topics, and you may already know you're interested in one of those. But if you don't, that's okay too, because there's a lot of ways to tailor this program with your interests and your desires in order to take your career to the next level. So that's sort of like the overview. It's got a lot of intellectual rigor to it. It helps you learn how to report it with nuance and to do that like high caliber professional journalism.
Thanks, Winnie. And just to introduce the rest of our guests, which I forgot to do at the beginning, we have representatives from the four concentrations. Arts and Culture, we have Professor Alisa Solomon from that program. Her colleague David Haydu is traveling today, another professor in the program. From the business concentration, as I mentioned, Winnie is a professor who is the core faculty member in that. And from the politics concentration, we have Professor Alexander Stille here to chat with you about that program. And then from the science concentration, we have two of the faculty members who are part of that program, Marguerite Holloway and Jonathan Weiner. So welcome to all of you. And if any of you wanted to add anything to what Professor O'Kelly had mentioned already about what the MA program is and how it differs from our MS program, please feel welcome to add any comments you'd like as well.
I might add one, which is when Nick Lemon, who's not here today, was conceiving of the program, um, there was a kind of assumption that the MS program was overwhelmingly about skills. And the thing that you sometimes heard journalism professors at Columbia and elsewhere say, there's nothing for you to learn on this campus. Your classroom is a city of New York. Now get out and start reporting. And that was kind of a little bit of the philosophy. And in conceiving of the MA program, I think Nick's idea was, wait a second, we're on the campus of one of the great research universities of the world. Surely there's stuff that we can benefit from by exposing our students to. And so the idea was to kind of dip into that world of research and ideas and enrich the kind of reporting. So yes, we do reporting, and yes, we do journalism, but it's also informed by exposure to the wealth of work that's being done in a variety of fields. And so the different concentrations dip into that in their own different ways. But I think that that exposure is sort of foundational to the MA program.
Great, thank you.
I could also add something about the way it's structured, or maybe we talk about that later?
We could. I could share my screen to actually have a visualization of the curriculum if that would be helpful, Marguerite, and then we can talk a little bit more about that as we do. 1 second for me to get that set up. All right. see, there's a little group of people. And then here's our kind of concentration overview here. So Marguerite, did you want to chat a little bit about that?
Well, I just wanted to say, sort of referring both to what Sandra was saying and what Winnie was saying, was that in the MS, you're taking lots of different courses and you're learning a lot of skills, not so much a focus on subject area expertise. But in the MA, the whole program is anchored by this seminar that runs across the entire year, and that is co-taught by the journalism school professors and then experts in all these different fields and subject areas. And I think that's really a really core difference, is that you meet twice a week for 3 hours each time. And once it's with your cohort and your journalism professor, and once it's really with an extraordinary guest who is an expert in, we can go into the different sort of subject areas later, but that's a very important point, and a really significant difference that is baked into the structure of the program. And I just wanted to mention that to follow up on what Sandra and Winnie were saying.
And I'll jump in and follow up a little on that. That's all true. And the intellectual richness applied to journalistic practice is, as my colleagues were saying, really a key element of what we're doing in the MA program. The other thing that I want to say about the seminar is not so academic, but related, is that we have a very intense and friendly and mutually supportive intellectual community in that room twice a week for 3 hours. And students usually create a WhatsApp group among themselves to, keep the conversation growing, to, wait, what stop am I supposed to get off at for our field trip? And they keep those groups going for years, like forever after graduation. And so, yes, there's all of this skills building and intellectual engagement and so on. And there's also becoming part of a community of journalists like you and different from you that you will stay connected to throughout your careers.
I'll add one more thing. I imagine we'll get into a lot of this in more depth, but a key part of the program is also a long form project, usually a long form print project, in which we mentor our advisees very closely. So it's sort of an old school editing experience that we try to provide, which is very hard to get, as probably many of you already know. It's very hard to get that nowadays when you're working out there alone as a freelancer or on a staff where you're churning out a lot of stuff on tight deadlines. Here you have most of the year meeting one-on-one with your advisor to brainstorm, find a great story, shape it, report it, and write it. And that really is a cornerstone of the year for most people here.
Great. And so we'll talk in more detail about each of the concentrations in a moment. But before we do that, I thought I'd ask one more question for people who are watching and are curious. We've mentioned this is a program for more experienced journalists. And what does that kind of mean in terms of how people should think about what kind of skills they should already possess in order to kind of, be, in good stead for this type of program? I thought I'd start with Winnie again and then open it up to the rest of the faculty.
Yeah, I try not to get something too prescriptive because, in fact, I've had students come from a variety of backgrounds who excelled in the program. I think just saying the word some experience is like sort of where we start off. For some people, maybe typical, that's at least a couple years, maybe reporting or doing something journalistic. Might vary. I've had students who, for example, were working more behind the scenes in audio projects or whatever, and they really wanted to develop their own repertorial skills in a deeper way. I've also had students who came from working in consulting for a couple of years, where they were writing more business oriented or research reports, and I knew that they really wanted to make that shift into journalism. So don't exclude yourself because you don't have X number of years in journalism specifically, but think about whether you've got the experience to handle like a basic kind of journalistic story. That might have come from, college or a little bit of work you did outside of it. It might come from different places, but that's what we're looking for. We're not going to run out on the first day and say, go out and talk to 12 people in the city and come back to us on what everybody's thinking about the parade they were just at. That's not the kind of work you're going to be doing in this program. So we assume a certain level of ability. Is that fair enough, everybody?
Yeah, I'd say that if you get an assignment like you might get in my arts and culture seminar to do, students are working on right now to do an art/cultural related story connected to the election season, that you would have the skills already to come up with some ideas, to figure out who you might have to talk to about that, where you might want to go, and not be afraid to go out and talk to people to do the reporting. Of course, if you need help, we're here to help, but the assumption is you already know how to do that. In the MS program, you'd learn how to do that. So what we'd be able to do is to say, okay, you know how to do that basic thing. Let's do a deeper story about this, not just something that you would do in an hour talking to people on the street.
Great. So then I think we'll just transition into each of the concentrations, and we'll start with arts and culture, the concentration I'm an alum of myself, and have Alisa tell us a bit more about that. Maybe we'll just start with kind of what are some of the skills and kind of critical skills, critical kind of knowledge you'll gain in the seminar if you choose to join the arts and culture group.
I mean, I think answering that it's probably true of all the concentrations that for reporting, it's kind of a two-pronged answer, or two strands, the same braid of related things. One is that you develop habits of mind that are oriented toward asking the questions beneath the questions, beneath the obvious questions, that you know how to pursue something more deeply, getting to the core of the concepts behind it, that you become better at placing emerging issues, things that are news, in historical, cultural, economic, socio-political contexts. They aren't just things that are happening in the air by themselves, but come out of something or relate to things that have come before. You become better at considering a wide range of diverse sources, of identifying the best experts to speak to, and knowing how to evaluate the kinds of things that they tell you. How reliable is it? Those kinds of things, which for us in arts and culture, they apply whether you're writing a reported story or if you're writing a work of cultural criticism that requires the same kind of grounding, the same kind of eye and ear for description, and the same kind of ability to think analytically.
Great. And under arts and culture, under that kind of umbrella, I know there's a lot of different interests, but is this a program that can fit people who, I know some of my people are interested in culinary issues, people are interested in architecture and art,
Absolutely. Yeah.
all.
Yeah. So I can say, right now in the current class, we have students whose primary interests are music, food, architecture, visual arts, more culturally, like subcultural expression, queer art, can't even think of all of them offhand, but absolutely. And the way that we organize the seminar is to look at issues that we might explore an issue through a particular genre or two, but the point isn't to study specifically that arts genre, it's to look at the larger question. So, for example, if we are looking at questions about cultural heritage, what is it? How is it defined? What rights accrue by virtue of it? Who enforces those rights if they can? We might look at some examples of the preservation of, say, Khmer dance in Cambodia, and of an indigenous foodways kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that we're only talking about dance and food, because you could apply some of the same questions and concepts if you're talking about other forms as well.
Great. And in every seminar, there'll be people called like faculty partners who will come in and lead different sessions and have readings that the students will discuss. Can you give us some examples of faculty partners who visit the seminar often and some of the subjects that they've tackled?
Sure. So just related to some of what we just talked about, Just last week, we had Professor Erin Thompson, who's from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She is the country's leading, she's her nickname is Art Crime Professor. She is the leading scholar on forgeries and on looted art and repatriation issues. We had a great session with her last week where she laid out, what some of those issues were. And then for the last hour, we did an exercise where we tried to research the provenance of some items for sale at a Sotheby's auction. We are meeting in, I think, a week with Professor Krishnendu Ray, who's a food scholar at NYU, to look at the relationship between culinary cultures or culinary expression and cultures, particularly looking at New York immigration cultures and how they're expressed and modified through food. We have some amazing sessions every year with Professor Paige West from the anthropology department here at Columbia on what is even the concept of culture. What do we mean when we say it? Where did that concept come from? How has it changed and morphed? What kinds of tropes are mobilized in a lot of cultural reporting? On Thursday, our own Dean Jelani Cobb is doing a session with us. We're doing a unit on history and the arts right now. And we're going to look at what I'm calling History Goes to the Movies on Thursday. We're going to look at some feature films that dealt with the civil rights and Black Power movements and consider both, how they're made as films and the perpetual question of what obligation does a feature film have to be factual when it's telling a historical story.
Oh, very cool. And so for people watching now, they might be curious on what alums have done with this type of training. What are some of the career paths they have gone on from the MA in Arts and Culture group?
Yeah, it's quite various and variable as some graduates change what they're doing over time, but just a few that spring to mind. Chris Ip, some from, I can't even remember what year anybody's from. I'll just say there was a editor at the Atlantic magazine, Casey Ifiani at Fast Company. Speaking of food, Bao Ang graduated from the program. He went to the food desk at the New York Times briefly, and then he was at Eater New York, and now he is the food columnist at the Houston Chronicle. Another food writer, Caleb Pershin, is the food writer at San Francisco Chronicle, and Diana Hubble writes for Atlas Obscura, just won last year a James Beard Award for feature writing. Another graduate, Sam Block, is writing a book on shade, which is grew out of a long essay that he did for Places Journal through an exclusive publishing opportunity that the MA program has with that journal. Megan Chan is at the Washington Post doing digital things. Chris Barabay is at 99% Invisible podcast. We have a recent graduate, Rosalind Colgan, who's an editor at Time Out New York, Surbi Gupta at New Lines Magazine, and Maria Garcia went right from our program to WBUR, the NPR affiliate in Boston, and is now a major producer at Futuro Media. So that's a bunch. I could go on, but maybe we should talk about some of the other concentrations.
Sure, I just mentioned there was a woman from last year's class, Noor Idris, who just published her capstone project in New Lines today, I think. So
Came out today, yeah.
very
Yeah,
cool.
that's a student who has been living in the US for about 10 years. Originally is from Syria, and she will talk about the capstone projects a little more later, but she had a travel grant to go back to Syria to do research for that story, which just saw the light of print this morning.
Great. So we'll move on to business and economics. And Winnie, do you want to talk a bit about some of the kind of skills and the kind of the knowledge people will gain in that seminar in order to cover all the kind of complex issues related to that beat?
Sure. I mean, I think I'd like to first just talk more broadly about the skills in the program because I do think it applies to all of them. So whatever you're thinking about here, you're going to learn how to do the kind of in-depth reporting that includes things like oral histories and dealing with statistics, dealing with academic research, literature reviews of what's been going on. In my concentration, we try to focus a lot on trying to understand the forces at play in the economy. At least in the fall, that's the emphasis. And in the spring, it shifts a little bit more to sort of the microeconomics, companies and markets and that sort of thing. But in the fall, we're definitely focusing on like what makes an economy work? What are the players doing? What are the impacts of that? Today, we went through something on the election, which is very exciting here in the US this year, looking at statistical work on what people are saying about the economy, what the actual economy is doing, how it polls. And then we went through a polling session where students understood what to make of polls and how to use them properly. That's just one little example. But throughout the program, I hope that the students get the skills they need to take their career to the next level. Some people come in with no business experience, but they know they want to be a foreign correspondent. And in order to do that, they know they need to understand how the economy works better. Others might want to become an education reporter. And once again, they're not understanding how the government funding works and they're trying to figure that out. So those are the kinds of things that people come to it for. I've had a lot of students this year come in for the investigative part of it, who want to be able to hold businesses and companies accountable and politicians for what they do. So we're going to learn how to follow the money, very simply. That's a big piece of it. And a big piece of it is just understanding all those forces at work. So I think that the students come out of here able to do business reporting and more economics reporting, whether they choose to do that on a small level at a trade publication or at one of the major media outlets.
Great. And so week by week, as Alisa explained, in their seminar, they have different faculty come in, faculty partners talking with the group. What are some examples of topics and people that come in to help your students better understand the business and economics beat?
Yeah, I'll just give you a couple examples. I'll be brief on this. One of my favorites every year is Torsten Slok, who is a top economist. In fact, he's rated the #1 economist on Wall Street, and he's been a great partner of this program for the last several years. He was previously at the World Bank and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, was at Deutsche Bank for a number of years, where he was rated the #1 economist on Wall Street. He's now at the Apollo Group, and he generously gives of his time to come and talk to the students on the record about everything going on in the economy and give them the same kind of presentation that he would to anyone else. And he helps them think about economics in a way that I think is really essential. As an economist, he's seeing all these different pieces of information, and he says he has to tell a story about it. He sees that as essentially what journalists need to do. So he helps them understand how to take a mosaic of information and convert that into a clear idea. And I'll give you one more example from the spring last year, just because it comes to mind, which is the CEO of Levi's. So we have a lot of people come in from the business world so that students can get familiar with working with them and understanding what they're doing. And he essentially went through a case study of what happened to the venerable company Levi Strauss, which almost failed at least twice under his purview and was resurrected. And he walked through all the numbers and what the company's goal was and how it had struggled, and was very bare in his honest assessment of it. And students got to ask all the same questions of him that they would of any other CEO. So that gives you a couple of ideas.
Great. And we'll take a moment or two just to talk about the trajectories of some of the grads of this program. I also have a little visual for that too, but feel welcome to talk about a few people who've come through the program. I just have
Yeah. I see right there what you're loading up. Two people who I know well. Olivia Carville on the left. She just is a recent grad in 2018, as I recall. She came here with quite a bit of experience working out of New Zealand and Asia, and she felt like she needed to be able to have a better ability to cover the underlying economics that were affecting the kind of social justice stories she was enjoying writing about. So she's now an investigative reporter at Bloomberg. She's won a couple of prizes. And she's working on a documentary for a couple of the pieces she's done that are pretty extraordinary. One was on Airbnb and sexual harassment and crimes, including rape and other horrible crimes at that company that were being hushed up. And she's also done a thing on young people and social media that's now being made into a documentary. So really exciting work there. Jeff Horowitz is quite well known for the work he's done on Facebook and Meta, and 2 different series, award-winning series both. He's gotten behind the scenes of what's going on at that company. There are many other people who have very different trajectories. Just looking at some examples here to think about. Ali Donaldson, who just graduated recently, is at Inc. I see Larry Madowo up there, who has got millions of followers over at Twitter, or X as we call it now, at CNN, where he is their Africa correspondent. Penny Ramirez came through here having done investigative journalism and worked on things like the Panama Papers, eager to take her investigative reporting to another level. And she's now a top editor at Futuro, where she says she's quite surprised to learn that all that business know-how she gained, she's actually applying not just to investigating companies, but also to running her own newsroom. So that's been a really delight. And there's many others.
Great, thank you. And then we'll move on to politics. And Professor Stille, do you want to talk a bit about some of the ways that people can really build, their careers to become stronger, political journalists, whether it's domestic politics, international, local politics, how the seminar is kind of, built to give them that kind of skill set?
Well, the seminar is organized so that you look at conceptual issues which can be applied to any geographical area in the world. We have a very international class this year. 10 out of 13 happen to be international students, foreign nationals. And the curriculum is designed so that you can really apply it to different parts of the world. So that, for example, at the beginning, we're looking at the way states function. And so two of my students, one who's Nigerian and the other who is Indian, are both doing stories that in some ways deal with what's called the resource curse, the way in which natural resources like oil end up distorting the economics and the politics of a country. So Olivia, who's Nigerian, is looking at her own country and trying to understand, like, why does this country frustrate me so much? Why does it function so poorly? And then when you look at what happens with oil, the story becomes much clearer. Nigeria is one of the largest oil deposits in the world, and yet they have to import all their gasoline from overseas because they have no working refinery, even though oil was discovered there more than 50 years ago. So that becomes a way of talking about areas of dysfunction in the society that if you didn't understand the importance of resources, you might have just saying like, nothing works in this country and I can't figure out why. Similarly, Prajwal, who's Indian, is writing a story about Guyana, which is a part of the world he didn't know, which is, in Latin America. And recently discovered oil and writes about the way in which that plays out with climate change because he's interested in environmental issues. Another example would be another student who is also Indian, doing a story about Myanmar and the drug trade. And so I think the way MA students approach stories that's different is rather than writing about the drug trade as like a criminal enterprise and the bad people that, carry guns and sell drugs, you're looking at it as a story of state failure, the fact that the government of Myanmar doesn't have control of its entire territory, that this drug cartel essentially controls a quarter or 40% of the country, and that extorts money from farmers, and it becomes, when you begin to think about groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas as groups that are essentially providing state-like services in their territories and substitute for some of the functions of the state. You see these issues in different and hopefully more sophisticated ways than is often presented in the news. So we're really trying to train our students to think about big important stories that they already are interested in, but in a new way that's fresh and hopefully a little more profound.
Great. And can you give some examples of whether they're scholars or journalists, people that come in to chat with your group to help them think more deeply about some of these topics?
Yeah. So just in the last week, like today, I taught this morning with a really interesting, brilliant young scholar whom I'd never had in class before, Unji Kim, who's Korean but teaches in the political science department here at Columbia, who's done really, really interesting work about the influence of entertainment TV and reality TV on our politics. And so everybody thinks that news is what drives people's political opinions, but her thesis in this book that she's writing and that she's been researching for several years is that things like reality TV, which has a kind of rags to riches formula to it, in which ordinary people are struggling to make something themselves, have the possibility of winning $1 million or getting a contract in Shark Tank or winning American Idol and having a career as a singer, that all this has a kind of Horatio Alger like rags to riches narrative, which feeds ideas of economic mobility that are actually contradicted by all the statistics we have about the lack of economic mobility. And so, of course, you end up with Donald Trump, star of his own reality TV show, as our president. And she's done interesting analysis about the degree to which people who are exposed to the Apprentice end up with different ideas about Trump based on that experience. So that was just one example, super interesting. The students loved it. She also gave just a great presentation.
We need
And
to do a joint session on that.
what's that?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
needs to be a joint session with arts and culture.
Yeah, no, it would have blended very nicely with arts and culture. And there's a lot of, I think, in general, we have these categories that we've invented for this program, but the truth is there's a lot of overlap. I had students that have strong interest in environmental issues and climate, who, I like to define politics rather broadly. Like I had a student who was uncertain initially whether she wanted to do the program. She said, I'm really interested in anthropology. And I don't know if that fits your idea of politics. And I said, absolutely. So she did a story about the birth rate in Israel, the fact that Israel has the highest birth rate of any country in the OECD, higher rates not just among ultra-Orthodox religious Jews, but also among secular non-religious Jews. And the Palestinians also have really, really high birth rates. And so there's a kind of demographic competition. The competition that we see happening on the ground in military terms is also happening in demographic terms. That to me is a quintessential political story, and understanding, what are the cultural forces that, let's say, lead to a high birth rate in a society like Israel, as opposed to a low birth rate in a society like Spain or Italy or South Korea. Um, so um, so we define politics quite broadly, and we had a great talk the other day from Peter Bierman in the sociology department, which I thought was really, really terrific. He's really good at explaining ways in which journalists tend to approach stories individually. Like if, let's say, at the beginning of the autism epidemic, as it was called, a journalist would naturally want to interview parents of children who suffer from autism and say what happened, and they'll tell their experience. Bierman, as a sociologist, got the health and life records of every child born in the state of California for 40 years, and then looked and identified clusters of autism and say, what do these clusters mean? And what he eventually figures out, after eliminating all sorts of possibilities, is that these are information clusters, that people get diagnosed with autism because they know other people who have children with similar problems, who find solutions to those problems, and they send them to the same doctors and they get the same diagnoses. And it's about the changing status of autism during the last 40 years, and autism going from being a stigmatized disease to one that's actually desirable because you can get social services and help for your child, which benefit them. So it becomes a disorder of the affluent, which is super interesting. So he's looking at the socioeconomics of illness and disease, the way in which certain diseases become degraded in terms of their socioeconomic status, and others become elevated. So things like that are just not part of the normal baggage of what political journalists get, but that help you think like, wow, that's really interesting. I never thought of that. And that gives me an idea for this other thing that I'm interested in. And it just generates really, really interesting, terrific stories among my students.
Great. And I know we could talk for another hour about what all the alums from all these programs are doing, but do you have some examples of what some of the MA Politics cohort have gone on to do with their careers?
Well, after teaching this morning, a student handed me a book written by somebody from last year's class, Davide Lerner, who went and did his master's project in Israel, and the work he did has now resulted in a book you're showing here on the screen. Casey Parks, who was in the class a few years ago, went on to write a terrific book called Diary of a Misfit, which was both based on her own experience growing up as a queer person in Texas, but also trying to resolve the mystery of a person she heard about within her own family who had lived in her parents' town when growing up, who identified as male but was biologically born female. Ben Taub was in the program 9 years ago and has gone on to be a staff writer at the New Yorker, does fantastic stories, a lot about terrorism, but all kinds of topics. He did a terrific master's project that he turned into a New Yorker profile. Abdi Latif Tahir, who actually talked to the class earlier this semester, is the West India, East Africa correspondent for the New York Times based in Nairobi, a wonderful person and doing terrific work covering a large number of countries in the sort of Horn of Africa area. And he is Somali originally. And I remember, in fact, when he applied to the program, I thought, God, this kid is terrific. I hope we can somehow get him here. How did he become such a good journalist growing up in the middle of the Somali Civil War? Because he grew up in a refugee camp in Kenya. The Kenyans kicked out a lot of their Somali refugees, and he was then dumped into Mogadishu, which was like in the middle of the Civil War. But this very, very bright and talented young person learned enough of journalism to make a very credible case for himself. And we were lucky to have him with the program. And he's been a huge help since then, talking to students and helping them out. Zebe Warsi, who you're featuring on the other side of the screen, was in the program 2 years ago. She is Indian, but working for the PBS NewsHour and has been doing really, really interesting, fun international stories, including some stories back in India where she was reporting on the Indian elections and similar stories, has been doing election coverage now, and has come up to New York a couple of times and visited the class as well, spoken to my students. So that's really nice. I should just say in general, something that hasn't come up, but I think is really incredibly important is the students in this program form really, really close bonds with each other. And I think if you poll them, they would list that among the best things that came out of the program for them, the rich professional and personal relationships that they form. What is also really fun about teaching this population of students is because these students have been working already, they come to the class with really interesting both life and professional experiences that make the discussion in the classroom exceptionally interesting and really, really rich. And they maintain their bond. They're also very helpful. We've got an amazing network of former students who are very kind and helpful and generous toward the people that are coming through the program. And I think that's a real rich resource.
Yeah, thanks, Sandro. And now on to the science concentration. Marguerite and Jonathan, thanks for joining us. And do you want to talk a bit about your seminar? I know one of you often, will teach in the fall and the other will teach in the spring. What are some of the topics and kind of skills you're going to help students build when it comes to the science beat?
All right, maybe I'll start because I'll talk a little bit about the fall. But Sandro, to your point, it's so funny. I was trying to set up an appointment to catch up with one of the science MAs, and she's like, I'm with Abdi, helping him report and work on a story in Nairobi. And they were in different years and different tracks, and they're working together. And that was really quite lovely. So the science program, and I think Jonathan and I just would like to make clear at the beginning, I was speaking for both of us, that you do not need a science background to be in the science program. I think we've heard over the years that people think that they need to have some training in the sciences or in public health or in medicine. That is absolutely not true. The program is designed to really make you have confidence about reporting on science, which, to use a phrase that Alisa, Professor Solomon, used before, is really one habit of mind. It's one sort of fundamental way that people have of approaching the world. which is to observe it, to analyze it, and to understand it. And so the science MA is really trying to take patterns to help students go develop that nuance and complexity and sort of understanding of science by taking different fields and looking at sort of patterns that you can get from them that you can then apply to reporting on science or medicine generally. So in the fall, we do history of science, which is across the whole year. We look at ecology, we look at climate, we look at AI, and physics. And what we'll do, say, for AI is use an understanding of sort of ethical and sort of technical issues in AI to talk about technology and how instruments or ways of understanding the world shape the questions that we ask and shape our understanding of the world. With physics, we might sort of look at quantum computing and then talk about metaphor as a way of understanding science and understanding how to communicate science. So everything that we look at sort of tries to get at, because you can't become an expert in quantum physics in a few weeks, or AI in a few weeks, or climate change in a few weeks, or ecology, or ecoepidemiology. But we're trying to find patterns within each of the subjects we look closely at that are then generalizable to reporting across all areas of science. And students really develop the confidence to do that. It's both a deep intellectual engagement, but it's also very practical. Like, you have to understand how to think critically about a scientific study, take it apart, write about it, sort of like the foundational building blocks of reporting on any area of science. And we also, Professor Solomon mentioned field trips. We also try to really get people out into the field and out into labs so that they can see the way science is practiced. They can understand the culture of science. That has included going to a quantum computing lab, going to Lamont Doherty, which is the climate sort of Earth Observatory division of Columbia, going to Greenwood Cemetery to understand why there's so many raccoons and what they might be presenting as disease risk in New York City and how that's changing with climate. So that's a bit about the fall. Jonathan, do you want to talk about the spring and sort of anything I've missed about sort of those larger issues?
No, you've covered it really well. And in the spring, we build on what you guys do in the fall. So, for instance, we're focusing in the spring on the life sciences. So we're looking at biology, at evolution, then building toward the science of medicine. Um, we bring in this wonderful statistician from the medical school who helps us look at recent medical papers that seem tempting for us to pounce on and write about and may or may not stand up. And so she helps us take them apart with a screwdriver, really look at the data, really look at the experimental methods, try to understand how these things are put together. And very often, the sausage wasn't worth the making, and it's not a story worth covering. So uh, we get a lot from those experts who come in and visit. And there are people who are coming at the life sciences from all different directions. One frequent guest has been Siddhartha Mukherjee, who is a very well-known oncologist that sees cancer patients all the time, also writes for the New Yorker and elsewhere eloquently about the science of medicine and the challenges of the medical field. And he can talk with us about both the science, the clinical work, and also the task of translating it. And we emulate that really in the writing that we do in the spring. The core project is to write either a profile of someone who's working in the life sciences or maybe somewhere in healthcare Doesn't have to be a doctor, could be anyone connected with the field, and to convey what that's like by hanging around by that fly on the wall access, and uh, and alternatively to write about a patient or a family, some people who are being deeply affected by some medical crisis, and what's that like going through that. So many of those stories and end up getting published, but whether they do or they don't, they're really deep learning experiences.
Great. And I'm going to share that slide again with some alumni. And I thought if Marguerite and Jonathan, you want to talk a bit about where people have gone on with this, great training that, is very broad in terms of what people could explore, whether it's, climate, environmental issues, medicine, scientific innovation, all of that good stuff.
Well, we have a lot of students who are, I was just curious to see who you're going to bring up. Oh, wow. Okay, so yes, we have students, Dominique Mossbergen, who's been covering health at the Wall Street Journal, Karen Pynchon, who did this just incredible book on tuna and climate change and biodiversity and fishing. And Sarah Hertes, who was the person I just mentioned a moment ago, who was collaborating with Abdi, who came here and had really wanted to go deep into investigative reporting and is now an investigative reporter at the Times. Her capstone project was on PFAS and on forever chemicals. And she published that, and then that led to this new stage in her career that we're all very excited about. Students have gone on to cover. Wait, Jonathan, you do a few, and then I'll keep going.
Okay, so Joanna Rothkopf went on to win an Emmy. I think that's the Emmy she's holding there for television writing. And I mean, these two couldn't be more different, but also, they've each accomplished so much. Harriet Washington has written a series of amazing books about race in America and how that has affected healthcare in America. So this one of her better known books, A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind. Um, so right, two graduates we're very proud of. Another one, I don't know if he's coming up, Ross, in your pictures, but
I couldn't recall. So yeah, please
yeah.
mention. I just wanted to put a few visuals out there, but yes.
Yeah, I'll just call out two others, Shayla Love, who's on the staff of The Atlantic, and Adam Isco, who's writing amazing things for The New Yorker, including a very powerful piece about homelessness, which led to a lot of policy discussion and also a staged reading by a number of famous actors in downtown Manhattan. A really creative way of trying to get the story out there.
And just to mention a few others, we have people at the Times-Picayune, a lot of people covering climate at the Washington Post and the New York Times, people at Vox. It's just sort of people who are now editors, which is very exciting. And to the point that several people have made about the community that comes out of the seminars and out of the program as a whole, we learned recently that the first cohort of the Science MA are all in a book club together and still in touch all the time and all practicing, I think almost all of them, science journalism. So very exciting.
And it's not all print either. We should add that Lucy Nicholson from some years back is now she's a Pulitzer Prize winning photojournalist and is now running the photography for AP.
Great. Before we move on from the careers, just one thing I should mention too is, of course, as you've kind of alluded to, none of you are kind of out of touch with people after they graduate. Like, there's a lot of great, keeping, in touch with the alumni about careers, but also other, advice and other, just social connection. So it's something that goes on beyond the 9 months that you're here, for everybody. Well, great. So I thought I'd move on to something we've talked about a little bit in each of these kind of conversations about the seminar, and that's the capstone project, which is a project all the MA students will undertake, no matter what concentration they're in, but is a really ambitious work of reporting and storytelling. Can each of you talk a little bit about how you work with students to develop those kind of projects and what kind of issues people have delved into when they've been in the program? Maybe we'll start with Alisa with arts.
Sure. And I want to say one more thing about reporting. It builds a little bit on what Professor O'Kelly said too, because you asked me about that before. And I talked about some general principles, but I also could have mentioned some more specifics, like, the investigative techniques or investigative techniques or the oral history, like Professor O'Kelly mentioned, understanding tax filings of arts institutions, public records, requests, real estate records for arts institutions, archival research, those kinds of things that are often forgotten, especially I think when people talk about arts reporting. People think that investigative stories don't involve arts and culture. They do, and we care about that, and we work on those kinds of things. And at the same time, like, we also love the arts, and we go to museums and performances and look at movies and go to concerts and public art and so forth. So we're combining those passions together. As for the capstone projects, like related to your question before, Ross, about our students interested in different genres and different kinds of focus on different things, absolutely yes. And in addition to the subject area or outside electives that students take as part of the program, which I guess you'll talk about a little later, which is one of the areas where they can specialize, or as Professor O'Kelly said, tailor the program to their interests. The capstone project is another where you get to work with a very close editor for the entire academic year on a story that you have a lot of passion for, a lot of interest in, that's going to develop your skills as a reporter, as a storyteller, as a prose stylist, all of those things. So just to give a couple of quick examples, had stories, I just had meetings with some of my thesis capstone project students today on and there's one who's working on a sort of architecture built environment, communal story related to two museums in different neighborhoods that are opening new buildings or wings in extensions soon, and their relationship to both the design questions about these museum buildings, but also how they are more than inert containers for the work that they show or the experiences that they invite, and that they are situated in actual neighborhoods where people live, go to work, have business enterprises, and so on, and what kinds of relationships are involved in all of that. So he'll be following these two expansion developments. Another student is interested in a Native community, indigenous community in Oregon, where she's from, that is beginning to develop a kind of tourist attraction around native foodways. And what does it mean to both preserve that form of cultural expression and to present it and market it to different kinds of audiences, many, probably most of whom are not themselves indigenous, and what's gained and lost and at stake and so on in that kind of enterprise. Third example is by a student from Kiev who has been the last couple of years covering the war in Ukraine with Reuters, and is going to do a story about artists who are dealing with being conscripted into therefore all men. There's no conscription for women, there are volunteer women fighters in Ukraine, but how some artists are dealing with being conscripted into the Ukrainian army. So that's just three quick examples of what's in the works right now.
Yeah, how about in the business group, Winnie?
Wow, rather than talk about specific stories, because many of them overlap, I just was thinking when Professor Stille was talking about resource curse, I have a couple students who are also very interested in the same topic. We do units on inequality and the labor market, understanding what's going on with jobs in this country. But for the capstone project, the goal here really is to delve deeply into something and to incorporate all of those various skills and ways of thinking that everyone has talked about so eloquently here. So learning how to do deep analysis, learning how to take data points and figure out if they're valid or not, interviewing people in depth so you get that kind of richness and layered reporting, observational skills. Most of my students have frankly never had the opportunity to do a long form narrative in this fashion. And whether they're going to be able to do that in their regular jobs when they graduate or not, I think the skills you get from doing this kind of work take you to another level. When I was working at the New York Times, I will say that people used to editors around me would say, well, we can't give that person a book leave. And I was always in favor of it because I found that every person who came back from book leave came back such a better reporter. And I think that's the experience you get from the master's capstone project. It's not necessarily about whether you publish the project or exactly what the topic is, although it'll be something you really care about. But you're going to master a whole new sets of skills because you're going to be accumulating so much information and trying to decide what's worthy and what isn't, and then be able to synthesize it into a story that then you figure out a compelling way to tell so that readers will not be able to put it down. That's really exciting. And we can't forget the travel. I just got to throw that in. This is a heavily international program, as Professor Stille mentioned. Super important that students get an opportunity to understand how things work around the world. Many of them will apply for small grants to enable them to travel over the Christmas break, where they will have a few weeks to do the kind of reporting we're talking about and then come back and produce their first draft. So there's a whole process for that we don't go into right now, but it is one of the things that really distinguishes this program.
Great. Sandra? I think you have to unmute it there.
Sorry, I would just to add to that, I like to tell my students when they start in the MA on the master's project, this is the opportunity for you to write the best story you've ever written. You will have 4 or 5 months to really dig in, to really report the heck out of something, to really get to know your subject. And you have at least 3 drafts that an expert editor will go through carefully and help you shape. First drafts rarely resemble third drafts. And as Winnie said, Professor O'Kelly, just to give her the dignity she deserves, it often involves foreign travel, but not necessarily. So like last year, I had a student who was actually German, who had a great idea to do a story on a refugee crisis on the island of Cyprus, which is divided between a Greek-controlled and a Turkish-controlled halves, and discovered an amazing story about African and Middle Eastern students who were being lured by deceptive advertising to go into the Turkish-controlled part of the island with the promise that they would get into the EU, and they didn't, and they were sort of trapped. But that story changed enormously over the course of, she was a really good reporter, did fantastic reporting, but she was a broadcast person who'd never written a long, complicated story like that. So the editing process was very, very intense. The story evolved considerably in the editorial process, and she ended up winning one of our top prizes for the story. So I thought that was a great experience. But for example, this year, I have a student who's actually from Denmark, but she wants to do a story locally because there are also great advantages to doing a story locally. You get to know your subjects better. You can develop a relationship which may evolve over a period of months. And you get to interview people, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. And that has its own, advantages. So she's beginning to report a story on apparently prostitution is being delegalized or decriminalized rather in New York. And as a result, there's a really interesting situation that's kind of evolving in Queens where that's all kind of happening. So you can do great stories overseas, you can do great stories locally. But I think the real key, and I think this is true of the program as a whole, I think a lot of students that come into the MA program feel frustrated by the paucity of editing they've generally gotten in the workplace and feel like they're under pressure to just bang things into print quickly. And one of the things that I try to do, and I think my colleagues try to do, is to really to use revision and line editing to help students really improve their writing, to really think about what they're doing in their pieces. And hopefully you then learn to internalize that editing process and make it part of your journalistic practice so that you then can do it on your own when you get out of here.
Great. And Marguerite and Jonathan, anything you want to add about just the quality of editing that students will experience working with both of you?
Well, I mean, everyone has pretty much said it all, but it is a very, very intense process. And I think I can speak for both of us. Again, we both love it. It's just total immersion in the subject area over the course of these 5 months roughly, and intense editing, intense conversation, intense reporting. And I think, as Professor O'Kelly said earlier, all of those skills, even though they are being applied for a long form piece generally, they serve every scale, every size of article or journalistic work that you would do in going forward. Learning how to really build relationships with sources over time, really thinking about structure, really thinking about deep reporting. And again, as Professor O'Kelly said, that attention to observation, to really looking and really using that to write and to inform questions and to inform analysis, I think are just, really incredible skills to have that you get during the capstone project. Jonathan?
Yeah, as everyone has been saying, these are skills that most of our students haven't had a chance to develop yet. And one of them, just to be really specific about it, is writing scenes. If you're writing a 150 or even 1,000 word story, you don't have much room for scenes, dialogue, a sense of the characters in your story, really developing all of that. How do you do that? How do you get a great scene that might be the lead of your story? So we really zoom in on that kind of craft talk, and we read great stuff that helps to inspire and helps us learn how to put these kinds of stories together and how to report them. And then, yes, as everyone's been saying, um, I think probably for most of us, it's one of our favorite parts of the year, because you just do go deep into every aspect of this over the course of 5 months of meetings. And I think it's exciting all around.
Great. I see we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to open up the chat. So if anyone who's watching wants to pose a question to any of our faculty or to myself, please direct those to me, Ross, the host, in the chat, and we'll see if we can raise some of those. But for now, a couple more things just to ask about. We alluded to the fact that a great thing about this program is that students are able to take 3 classes, usually outside of the journalism school, subject area classes, to better understand some of the issues they may be reporting on. Maybe Winnie, can you talk about that, and also ways that people can gain other types of skills if they're looking for that at the school while they're here in the MA program?
Yeah, and we've also been tweaking the program. So the goal here is to create a flexible program that responds to what your desires are. If you come in and you've been doing mostly print work and you really think you've just dabbled, or you want to dabble in audio and learn how to work on audio podcasting, we're going to find ways to help you do that. That's part of our commitment here. Or you've been writing about politics, you're really interested in pursuing that, but you also want to get those investigative skills. We're going to find ways for you to do that. without going through all the curriculum options because it's a little complicated and I don't think it's really the moment to be focusing on that. Just know that those options are available to you. I mean, I have students who are more interested in getting better at data, investigative, and other areas or podcasting in this year's class alone. So that is a possibility. In addition, as Professor Stille mentioned early, when the program was created, the idea here was that you have this incredible wealth of resources available to you at Columbia University, this amazing research institution. So you can also take courses in things like your particular interest. I find that things like human rights over at the international school. Some students are really interested in law and they take courses in that. I know for all the concentrations, it's very different, and you help students direct themselves toward the most interesting, fulfilling courses that they can take. That is a luxury. You don't get that anywhere else. And I think that's one of the specialties of this program. It's really one of its secret sauces is that you get all of that at your disposal. And this incredible group of faculty that I'm lucky to be a part of here will help you find your way to achieve all that.
And then a key question I see in the chat, one that I was going to ask anyway, which is just what do you look for in a strong application to this program, regardless of which concentration it is? What kind of things stand out in an MA application to you? Anyone wants to take that?
I would say one thing which I think is often overlooked is, and my colleagues may read these applications differently than I do, but I always pay special attention to the personal essay that people submit because many journalists are working for a publication that may have a rather stylized format. You can only write in a certain way, the style of the publication. You can't quite get a sense of the writer's personality, the writer's writing ability, if they've been working for a place with rather strict rules about how you write. The personal essay is an opportunity where you're completely free to those personal essays to tell us things about yourself, what makes you different from everybody else on the planet. I remember reading an application that made me laugh like 3 times out loud while reading it, and I thought this is somebody I definitely got to get into the class. I hope his journalistic chops are up to the essay, which fortunately they were. So, try to avoid the kind of cliched thing of I knew I wanted to be a journalist when my grandmother brought me into her lap and started reading, the newspaper to me on Sunday, kind of cliche, but tell us who you are and what makes you tick and what excites you and what makes you want to do the kind of work that we do. And so I think that's an often overlooked opportunity are those personal essays. And obviously, we do look at the published work. I mean, something that I would also avoid is, and this is trickier for people who do broadcast, it's hard to tell who does what in some broadcast stories. And so, or people will submit an interview with a famous person. And so the journalist is asking 3 questions and the famous person is talking on and on. And then we don't really know what the candidate journalist has actually contributed to this because they basically submitted something that's a talking head kind of submission. So I think those don't tell us very much about the candidate. So you want to think about, submitting things in which your contribution is plain for us to see, and we can tell, the kind of work that you've been doing.
And yeah, I agree with all of that, and I want to add a few things. I look for intellectual curiosity in the applications, in the essays, the clips, and related to that, an eagerness to work hard and not just go for the surface. For the surface story, you might not have had an opportunity at a workplace to do something deep yet. And maybe that's in fact why the MA program appeals to you. So in the essay, that's an opportunity for me and others on the committees to hear about those kinds of things that you want to do. What kinds of ideas are compelling to you? We don't need to read an essay, a prose version of your resume. We have the resume. So what we want to hear in the essays is more about the ideas that motivate you, the stories you want to tell, and we want to see those structured and written. We're also, like in a pitch that you'd be making for a freelance article, we're also looking at the way you write and how you think and how you put something together in those essays. I'd say that our students are also people who work hard and want to work hard. It's an incredibly intense program. And I think we also attract students who have a kind of communal spirit and an eagerness to be in a mutually supportive environment where, of course, you're challenging each other and yourselves in your work with colleagues, but it's not a competitive environment. We're not looking for people who want to come here and prove that they're smarter than the next person in class, but rather that all these smart people in class together are encouraging each other to think in new ways, to entertain different ideas, to think differently about how they thought about something before, to see something from a perspective they hadn't considered because the person next to them comes from a different kind of place and experience. And so, openness as well.
Great. And a question here about a program that we've recently unveiled under Dean Jelani Cobb, which is the Loan Repayment Assistance Program, LRAP for short. Maybe Winnie, could you tell people a little bit about what that is and how that might be of interest to potential MA students?
Yeah, it's really exciting. I guess I should say there are many possibilities for when you graduate, and I know that's always on your minds. There are fellowships at the university which you don't want to ignore, which we haven't mentioned, the Columbia Journalism and Investigations Fellowships. There are others with INN, which is the Independent Newsroom. There's support for various projects in terms of prize awards. So there are Pulitzer Center, the Harris Prize, and others where you can get money to pursue a project. So it's not like you're going to graduate and just disappear and say, it was nice seeing you. There are things going forward. But another thing that we've added, which we're really excited about because of the potential for students, it's called the Loan Assistance Repayment Plan. And the idea is that if you go to work for a nonprofit organization, and in the United States, many, many news organizations are now being structured as nonprofits. They can be larger organizations like the Marshall Project or ProPublica, or smaller organizations online, primarily covering niche markets, whether that's the undocumented or many others around this country. If you're working for one of those, we understand that it's harder for the pay to be good. We understand you're doing a public service. So through the generosity of our donors, you can apply for a program and have $10,000 of loans for your journalism school experience forgiven or repaid at the end of 1 year. And that program can continue for up to 5 years, resulting in repayment of up to $50,000 in student loans. This is available to our domestic students at this point in time. That's the way it works. And it's available to anyone who goes to work for a nonprofit. So that would be anyone who's doing that. It's if you're going to work abroad, we don't have through the same processes of financial aid to be able to accommodate that. But right now, it's an exciting program. We've taken many students through year 2 of loan repayment. It makes a huge difference in their lives to get that burden kind of lifted off their shoulders. The only qualification is you keep working for that nonprofit and that you be current on any student loans you have. It doesn't apply to other loans in your life, but it does apply to loans you take out to attend school here. And so that's a really exciting new opportunity for our students.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I know we're hitting the end of our time to chat today. It's been a challenge to talk about this program in such a short amount of time since there's so many great things we can talk about in terms of every concentration, in terms of the overarching program itself. But thank you so much, Professor Alisa Solomon, Professor Winnie O'Kelly, Professor Alexander Stille, Professor Marguerite Holloway, and Professor Jonathan Weiner for joining us today. And I know people had some questions we didn't get to today, and please join us at the link I put in the chat where you can meet with our admissions team. I saw some questions about educational financing, the admissions process itself, so we can help you through that. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the deadline to submit an application for the MA program will be January 5th, so there is still a good amount of time to explore this program further, look on our website, chat with our team here, and also we have a separate scholarship application for people applying to our master's program, which is open now, so that's a separate process for people applying to our MA or MS programs, and you're welcome to start that and to meet with our team to ask more questions about that part of the process too. But thank you again, everyone. Thanks again for your great questions. Thanks for tuning in from around the country and around the world to hear more about the MA. And we look forward to keeping in touch. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.